Question 2. Does money make you powerful? Our goals for this lesson. We'll learn why the presidents of the late 1800s are often forgotten. We'll understand the ways money and power led to both corruption and corporate philanthropy in the late 1800s. We'll consider key ideas such as bribery scandals, city bosses and political machines, and the gospel of wealth. Our big idea. The late 1800s was a time of enormous political corruption and the beginning of corporate philanthropy. Let's get started with our introduction. The Gilded Age was a time during which a few people controlled most of America's money. This inequality has repeated itself at various times in America's history, including in the present. Wealth is often seen as a mark of success, and industrialists were either looked up to or reviled for their extravagant wealth, but certainly respected for the power their wealth bought. Politicians in the Gilded Age understood the power of money. Many of them took money from business owners in exchange for favors. Bribery was common, and corruption in city government was so prevalent that it was practiced openly. But the great monopolies of the past do not exist today. And although there are still dishonest politicians who take bribes for favors, our current situation is far better than the days of the Gilded Age. So, money did not always win out. What do you think? Does money make you powerful?
The forgettable presidents. The Gilded Age is usually remembered for the accomplishments of thousands of American thinkers, inventors, entrepreneurs, writers, and promoters of social justice. Few politicians had an impact on the tremendous change transforming America. The presidency was at an all-time low in power and influence, and the Congress was rife with corruption. State and city leaders shared in the graft, and the public was kept largely unaware. Much like in the colonial days, Americans were not taking their orders from the top. Rather, they were building a new society from its foundation. The American presidents who resided in the White House from the end of the Civil War until the 1890s are sometimes called the forgettable presidents. A case-by-case study helps illustrate this point. Andrew Johnson was so hated he was impeached and would have been removed from office were it not for a single Senate vote. Ulysses S. Grant was a war hero, but was unprepared for public office. He had not held a single elected office prior to the presidency and was totally naive to the workings of Washington. He relied heavily on the advice of insiders who were stealing public money. His Secretary of War sold Native American land to investors and pocketed public money. His private secretary worked with officials in the Treasury Department to steal money raised from the tax on whiskey. Many members of his administration were implicated in the Credit Mobilier scandal, which defrauded the American public of common land. Grant himself seemed above these scandals, but lacked the political skill to control his staff or replace them with officers of integrity. His successor was Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes himself had tremendous integrity, but his presidency was weakened by the means of his election. After the electoral votes were counted, his opponent, Samuel Tilden, already claimed a majority of the popular vote and needed just one electoral vote to win. Hayes needed 20. Precisely 20 electoral votes were in dispute because the states submitted double returns, one proclaiming Hayes the victor, the other Tilden. A Republican-biased electoral commission awarded all 20 electoral votes to Republican Hayes, and he won by just one electoral vote. While he was able to claim the White House, many considered his election a fraud, and his power to rule was diminished. James Garfield succeeded Hayes to the presidency. After only 4 months, his life was cut short by an assassin's bullet. Charles Guiteau, the killer, was so upset with Garfield for overlooking him for a political job that he shot the president in cold blood on the platform of the Baltimore and Potomac train station. Vice President Chester Arthur became the next leader. Although his political history was largely composed of appointments of friends, the tragedy that befell his predecessor led him to believe that the system had gone bad. He signed into law the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which opened many jobs to competitive exam rather than political connections. The Republican Party rewarded him by refusing his nomination for the presidency in 1884. One president impeached, one president drowning in corruption, one president elected by possible fraud, one president assassinated, and one disgraced by his own party for doing what he thought was right. Clearly, this was not a good time in presidential history. Political corruption. This was an era of congressional supremacy. The Republican Party dominated the presidency and the Congress for most of these years. Both houses of Congress were full of representatives owned by big business. That is to say, big business owners donated such large sums of money to the politicians that the people's elected leaders listened more carefully to their corporate supporters than to the voters themselves. Laws regulating campaigns were minimal, and big money bought a government that would not interfere. Similar conditions existed in the states. City governments were dominated by political machines. Members of a small network gained power and used the public treasury to stay in power and grow fabulously rich in the process. Becoming mayor of a big city in the Gilded Age was like walking into a cyclone. Demands swirled around city leaders: better sewers, cleaner water, new bridges, more efficient transit, improved schools, and suitable aid to the sick and needy were some of the more common demands coming from a wide range of interest groups. To cope with the city's problems, government officials had limited resources and personnel. Democracy did not flourish in this environment. To bring order out of the chaos of the nation's cities, political bosses emerged who did not shrink from corrupt deals if they could increase their power bases. The people and institutions the bosses controlled were called the political machine. Personal politics can at once seem simple and complex. To maintain power, a boss had to keep his constituents happy. Most political bosses appealed to the newest, most desperate part of the growing populace, the immigrants. Occasionally, bosses would provide relief kitchens to receive votes. Individuals who were leaders in local neighborhoods were sometimes rewarded city jobs in return for the loyalty of their constituents. Bosses knew they also had to placate big business, and did so by rewarding them with lucrative contracts for construction of factories or public works. These industries would then pump large sums into keeping the political machine in office. It seemed simple. You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. However, bringing diverse interests together in a city as large as New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago required hours of legwork and great political skill. All the activities mentioned so far seem at least semi-legitimate. The problem was that many political machines broke their own laws to suit their purposes. As contracts were awarded to legal business entities, they were likewise awarded to illegal gambling and prostitution rings. Often profits from these unlawful enterprises lined the pockets of city officials. Public tax money and bribes from the business sector increased the bank accounts of these corrupt leaders. Voter fraud was widespread. Political bosses arranged to have voter lists expanded to include many phony names. In one district, a 4-year-old child was registered to vote. In another, a dog's name appeared on the polling lists. Members of the machine would vote early and often, traveling from polling place to place illegal votes. One district in New York one time reported more votes than it had residents. The most notorious political boss of the age was William Boss Tweed of New York's Tammany Hall. For 12 years, Tweed ruled New York. He gave generously to the poor and authorized the handouts of Christmas turkeys and winter coal to prospective supporters. In the process, he fleeced the public out of millions of taxpayer money, which went into the coffers of Tweed and his associates. Attention was brought to Tweed's corruption by political cartoonist Thomas Nast. Nast's pictures were worth more than words, as many illiterate and semi-literate New Yorkers were exposed to Tweed's graft. A zealous attorney named Samuel Tilden convicted Tweed, and his rule came to an end in 1876. Mysteriously, Tweed escaped from prison and traveled to Spain, where he was spotted by someone who recognized his face from Nast's cartoons. He died in prison in 1878. Not until the dawn of the 20th century would serious attempts be made to correct the abuses of Gilded Age government. The gospel of wealth. From these examples of graft in business and government, it would seem that men with wealth and positions of authority during the Gilded Age only thought of enriching themselves. However, this was not always the case. As mentioned earlier, many of the great industrialists of the era gave away huge sums of money. Steel magnate Andrew Carnegie is remembered for articulating this philosophy. Carnegie put his ideas into print in 1889 in an article entitled Wealth, or as it is more commonly known, The Gospel of Wealth. In it, Carnegie describes the responsibility of the new upper class of self-made rich. He proposed that the best way of dealing with the new phenomenon of wealth inequality was for the wealthy to redistribute their surplus means in a responsible and thoughtful manner. Normally, wealthy families passed their fortunes down to the children, such as was the case in Europe. Carnegie disliked this idea, arguing that dependents should be supported by their work, not with their parents' money. In The Gospel of Wealth, Carnegie asserted that hard work and perseverance lead to wealth, and made it clear that the duty of the rich was to live modest lifestyles. Carnegie argued that surplus wealth is put to best use when it is administered carefully by the wealthy. Carnegie also argued against wasteful use of capital in the form of extravagance, irresponsible spending, or self-indulgence, instead promoting the administration of money over the course of one's lifetime toward the cause of reducing the difference between the rich and the poor. Carnegie himself gave away his fortune building libraries across the nation. Some 2,509 libraries were built around the world with his money. In many towns, the main library is still known as the Carnegie Library. Carnegie Mellon University and Carnegie Hall in New York City were also established with his financial support.
Conclusion. The influence of money in politics is not a story that is restricted to the Gilded Age. Of course, people with money have advantages that the poor do not, and one of these advantages is the ability to use money to influence others. Sometimes, business owners manipulated politicians. Sometimes they used the money to buy votes and became politicians themselves. In cities, elected officials formed political machines and used their access to tax money to enrich themselves and be reelected. At the same time, however, men like Andrew Carnegie used some of their financial power to benefit humanity through philanthropy. As you will learn in later readings, the corruption that was rampant in the Gilded Age was outlawed when voters acted together to make change. Instead of a few individuals with access to money, the collective power of the common citizen won out. Some would argue that we are again in a time when the 1%, the few super rich, are again making decisions and influencing politics. Based on what you know of the Gilded Age, what do you think? Does money make you powerful?